Cool. We're here to discuss kind of what's after DevSecOps for GitLab. And we think it's ModelOps, kind of training and deploying or ML and AI models, full life cycle for models. All the code you're going to have in the future, you're going to have code, or in the future, currently, you have code and you have your models and they need to collaborate. And probably you want to control them from the same software because they interact. And we think that functionality should come to GitLab. Bruce, you have the first question. And I haven't prepared a presentation. This is all just, there's the doc with some ideas, but this is really early. We have 0 engineers on it currently, but there was more input than time allowed for the board meeting. So let's do it here. Bruce?
Yeah, I may be on a bad...
You are.
Connection. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, well, half.
Sort of.
Give it a go.
Yeah, if it's not that good, I don't know if I want to get into a long conversation, but you saw my comments in there, Sid. I think this is a good discussion, especially if it should be a separate product versus a tier. And then my advice was to run more of a design program / validation to just to.
Well, we got parts of that.
We got parts of it. And the nice thing of Bruce being on a bad connection that I can just do different things and then pretend I didn't hear the suggestion. So Bruce, I'm not set on the pricing for this. I think we really have to look into that. The nice thing is, a lot of the early functionality in this will be open source anyway. So we can determine the pricing later. For now, I'm going to assume it is part of the single product. I think a lot of the management, the analytics, the compliance, the role-based access control features in GitLab, I think they're really useful for both. I think if you want a separate product, I think there's enough options. I think our special sauce is going to be kind of combining the world of code and models. So part of the same product, pricing unclear, but we can just delay that problem, which is preferable because we will know what we have to a much greater extent in the future. And then we can do a design exploration. I don't have a strong opinion. I know there's some competing offerings, which I think are fun. There's offerings from Databricks, DataRobot, Pachyderm, which are about $1,500 per user per month. So they tend to have a common price point, which is interesting. So I assume there's kind of an offering brewing there where everyone is trying to offer about the same. So maybe we'll just take inspiration from that and kind of go chase that market.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sid, can I back up a second? I just want to give, as the reason I'm particularly excited about this is that over the last, so Bruce and I have been living in this enterprise apps and infrastructure world for 20 plus years, and the last generation that I think shifted how enterprise apps really functioned was the advent of big data and the fact that suddenly everything had to be data aware. And it seems to me like this, the AI ML evolution will follow that same pattern where it will become clear that anything that doesn't engage with machine learning is going to be left behind. So curious if the big data world has given us any clues as to how to be most effective here. is there a path where people have learned how to, in the process of building great applications, incorporate data that will inform how you think about integrating machine learning and AI into ModelOps?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's many ways to answer it. I'll have a stab at a perspective. I think so far the whole data world is very separate from the coding world. In the data world, we're only just about to start seeing that. Data ops, it's called there, where they started at least kind of using modern tools to handle data. It is like, if you look at the most successful data company right now, it's Snowflake, and it's more, it doesn't do a lot of compute. It's mostly really a warehouse. Databricks is a very complete offering, but kind of hard to run, but they do a bit more compute. I think they're very separate worlds, and I think there's a way to get into ModelOps from the data angle, and I assume that a lot of players are going to do that too. We're coming at it from the code angle, which I think is valid. And
Sid, when you say not a lot of compute, you mean running ML models?
yeah, like, I don't think Snowflake can train my models or something like that. I think they see themselves as just a warehouse, and you run stuff on top of it.
Well, they now have Spark in the warehouse, but yes, that's not their strong suit historically. But I was just trying to understand what you meant by compute.
Yeah, that they use compute to run the warehouse and to execute the queries. I don't want to say it doesn't drive compute, but meant more like if you look at data versus, I don't know, applications. But I could totally see a Snowflake app store and things like that in the future.
If you come from the developer side, not from the data side here into ModelOps, then I think I would agree with Bruce that one of the things that would be very useful is to have a set of design partners that are very well versed in the field that can help us shape the initial offering. And I don't care about pricing here. I care about like making it maximally useful for our intended audience, because there are subtle differences between the developer community and folks building models. So for example, the iteration time is very high. Very often, the end user is very early in the process, because that's where my raw data comes from. That's where hints for labeling come from. That's where hints from, oh, this model has now drifted too far, and or here's a challenger model. That's where all these insights actually come from. So us building more of a muscle there and having empathy for exactly those problems, I think we understand probably like 70% of it really well, just because it comes from the developer side. But there is a 30% that is very different and maybe a bit weird. So being very close to the end users here and having empathy for these particular types of problems is kind of a big deal.
Yeah, I agree with that, Sven. So for instance, I had 2 machine learning teams at my last company, and very high-powered people, PhDs from Cambridge and MIT, and they spend 85% of their time cleaning up data and normalizing and fixing holes and stuff like that. And if we can just help them with that problem, like understand it, have that empathy, help them maybe learning from the big data companies about how to do that effectively and rapidly, then we give them a head start. We allow them to spend more time, tuning hyperparameters and actually making their models more performant.
And it's subtle problems that are not like, they're not even that much rocket science, but very often there's a README file that actually tells me what happened to the data that I then run through a bunch of code and transformation. Then there's special sort of snippets for the training and all of that. And the README file has gotten stale and it is not really accurate anymore. And now I can't really recreate the artifacts that got recreated by my predecessor, for example. So now I'm stuck. So I need to go and find that person. And like, it's all that sort of stuff that is not really rocket science, but versioning the data together with the model and making certain it is actually clear what has happened here. That's kind of an issue tracking sort of thing. But having enough empathy for these sort of problems, that's what I would inject into this process. And then my second piece of advice would be to start small and very useful. So the surface area for that is potentially very large. So for example, how do you handle challenger models or that sort of stuff? But let's start with the core cycle that needs to run well. The data and the model, the deployment, the feedback loop from that. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that we need to add, like security, prevent model stealing, and like there's a long iterative list we can go through. But getting this core functionality really right, so people that use it every day really love it, that to me is the key. And I haven't seen anybody doing a really good job on that yet.
Yeah, we do have some machine learning projects internally, small ones like label recommendation engines and things like that. So there will be a feedback loop to dog food some of the stuff. But if we find these, let's say these 3 customers that you're talking about, and we partner with someone doing machine vision, their models are going to take 2 weeks to train versus ours might take an hour, and that's a substantial difference. And we'll learn different things from that engagement. Whereas we don't have any. There's no applied machine vision that we have the excuse to build internally. So I think we need to find that outside. I think that's right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like picking your design partners smartly is. That's a separate topic, and figuring out what to use. I would, for example, a design partner like, speaking like OpenAI or something, they are very different than most other people in the world. They train extremely large models, for example. So picking wisely here for the bulk of the market and where we think the market is going is probably probably good access.
Maybe it's someone, like one that was doing linguistics, one that was doing machine vision, one that was doing genomics. That would cover a lot of ground. Obviously, it would matter more whether or not they're engaged. So I wouldn't say we have to do these specific industries, but I think we could cover a lot of the problem space with a handful of a really impassioned partners.
I would add to that, they need to have some models in development and some models in deployment, and already know how to change models from one to the other. So maybe their tooling sucks for doing it. That's a reason why we exist, but at least they need to understand the difficulty of pushing models into deployment and then monitoring them and then going back and making the model better. They need to at least have gone through this cycle once or twice.
Yeah.
So not a shop that is developing a lot of model but hasn't really put something into production yet.
They need to have
they don't know what's wrong with the process yet.
Yeah, that was one of our main interview questions for adding to these 2 teams that I ran in the past. Was we asked data scientists, like, how do you know when your model is correct? And a surprising number of people would fail that interview question because they didn't have a sense of like the objective measurement of the results. And then like you say, measuring that, seeing how they perform, moving forward and iterating on it, but not the way we iterate on code in these small feedback loops, these multi-week training sort of feedback loops.
This is maybe a little bit in a side. A good question I always find is, if I were a new employee in your shop and you would point me to a particular ML problem that you're trying to solve, how many hours would I need to spend in order to just to recreate what you have? And how many people would I need to actually ask to get it to work? Or can you just point me to a thing and then like, that's it, like I'll be good. Like assuming I'm competent, right? So,
and if you're competent, the right answer is usually, well, that doesn't require ML. So the people that understand like the specific things that ML is really good at versus people that just throw it at the wall.
I think you're hitting on 2, Spencer had talked about 2 pieces of visibility, right? The first visibility piece, which is just understanding the process and how you got there. And then the second is understanding how what is the implication of the ML model that you're using so that you don't get lost in it. I think there's so much of, we sort of have gone down a rabbit hole and we don't even remember how we got here. And if you can provide visibility on both the front end and the back end, what are the inputs and do we understand how we got to the starting point? And then what is the impact or implication of this, ML model? then you're going to create a ton of value. And working with partners, you'll be able to figure out how do you manage both sides of that visibility.
I propose we're not going to work with partners. I think we need an iteration loop that's extremely fast. We need to start very simple. And we need to work with people who are already GitLab users, because otherwise getting them to use GitLab is going to be too high of a hurdle. And we can find all three in the people at GitLab who are already trying to apply ML to kind of improve our product. So I think we can just cater to them. The only time we've kind of really successfully made a product was GitLab CI, which was made just to test GitLab, not for anybody else. So we've seen that work before. I do think it's important that the kind of the nomenclature we use that is like consistent with the market. We should speak the language of the model trainers, but I'm totally. I think it would be preferable to have an internal customer. I see the downsides of it, but I think the upsides of a faster loop and kind of already using GitLab outweigh it, because I think it will be very hard to get quick feedback from an external customer, and it will be really, really hard to get them to use GitLab for their ML models at this point, because it's.
Do you think you have enough coverage? So it covers enough of the types of things that so internal is obviously preferable for speed reasons alone, but then the question is, do we have enough coverage?
Just to set expectations, we're going to have one engineer working on this.
Okay, you have enough coverage. Okay,
we don't need a ton of coverage. We actually like
Okay, you have enough coverage.
Yes.
Never mind.
Hey, Sid, just to push back on that a little bit, and I missed the first couple of minutes of the conversation, but some of the companies on your list of where you're going or portfolio investments that I've made over time. And so we spent a little bit of time in the space. And one of the biggest pain points and I think opportunities is the fact that we've seen, different constituencies with very different needs. And so the data scientists very focused on the open source and, kind of developing and building the models. And then, business analysts or data engineer or others focused on, the deployment, quality, governance, a bunch of other topics. And I think none of these solutions have really found and connected these multiple, constituents. And so if you did that loop internally, would you identify the same friction areas that exist? Because you can kind of force it potentially within GitLab versus in the environment, you would see the natural tensions that have existed traditionally between these different user segments.
Yeah, I think we appeal to some of the data scientists, although I think for a lot of people, they start with something simpler outside of GitLab. I think the way we're going to make our product popular in the end is more going to be like the way we make secure popular than the way we make CI popular. And secure is really look, we need to do this as an organization, and the current tooling is just too inconvenient. So it is a bit of a, we'll do great with the governance part, and it's going to be governance that's at least acceptable to the other people. So there's less kicking and screaming when you drag the data scientists and the business analysts to GitLab ModelOps than anything else. But that will be the impetus to change. That's our strong suit, that compliance and everything else.
So you're not going after the data scientists?
I think I just don't want to be competing with Panda and stuff like that. I don't see us. I think that's going to be hard, and I think we'll partially get there. But I think that we'll appeal to the 5% of the users who like ModelOps today. It's a small subset, and the whole rest will be convinced because there's no other way to deploy their model than to go through GitLab because of the IT organization mandating it. And then they find out, oh, it's not so bad. But maybe that's wrong. Like GitLab started upstream, not downstream. So maybe we should aim for upstream. Just sounds hard to me.
I mean, I think the suggestion and what you're saying, Sid, are totally compatible in my head, which is, what they're suggesting is outside help, partner with other organizations, learn from them. But we would do it in our way. We'd iterate. It wouldn't be a formal design program with partnerships and contracts and things like that. It would be the way we iterate. We're an open source project, so of course we're looking for participation and usage. And yes, we'd have our internal use case, but we, hopefully as rapidly as possible, find outside people that are willing to collaborate, and we get the feedback that they're suggesting is really important of getting product market fit on this. So.
Yeah, there's kind of 3 phases of measuring success. The first wave is contribution. So in the beginning, we'd be measuring the success of the single engineers on it by how much outside contributions did you get. The second wave is usage, and the third wave is revenue. But it's one before the other. And so, yes, we'll be partnering with outside organizations, except we won't know in advance who that will be, because it will be people who use it and are missing functionality and are adding that.
But listen, I mean, I think there's a super exciting opportunity because everyone you speak to in that value chain that's disjoint, talks about like, this is code. Why doesn't it run like Git? Like, why doesn't it run smoothly, and why does it take, I think Eric made the point earlier, like a week or two, versus an hour. And so there's a huge opportunity. I think it'll be, just interesting to see the way that you bring the value chain together.
That's exactly the point I was trying to make. It is not just code. It is a slightly different beast. And so that means it has a slightly set of different stakeholders. It has labeled data. It has way more drift. When I write code, typically, that's hopefully the end of it, at least for a little while. But like I have constant drift. Like what is valid today might not be valid tomorrow in the model. I have data versioned together with my code. My training only makes sense, for example, for a particular set of training data, and my cross-validation only makes set on a particular cross-validation set, for example. So it is slightly different. That's what I meant by this sort of empathy for the problems of the folks that deal with that day to day. Now, if we can find those folks internally and we can speed up development, I have no problem with that. That is great, actually. But it is a little bit different than just the code. So I want to break a lance for the people that have to struggle with these problems every day, because it's their life we should be making better. And so they should be have a big voice on, for example, what are the first set of features? How does the interface for something like that actually look like? All of that.
Well, I do think one of the advantages of what Sid's describing is that the key here is to figure out what's the unique and competitive advantage coming from GitLab and for our customers to then deploy ModelOps. And so, there is no better customer in that regard than GitLab to know what are the values that are being brought into these models, into this chain. So, because ultimately we could go about solving this problem independent of GitLab, but it wouldn't be a logical path. So I think we always have to return to this question of, why are we in the best position to solve this problem, and that will help lead this discovery.
Yeah, and I don't know yet where our first is. That both makes total sense, both David and Sven. I'm not sure yet where our first product will be, or like the first piece we'll start iterating on. I think it's unlikely to be kind of data wrangling, kind of tidying up the data before. Super big problem, super important, much further from GitLab. So like we wouldn't have an advantage. I just use one of the existing data wrangling solutions. If I was those people, So I'm not sure yet where the code and the model really interact. And one on top of my mind is kind of rolling out the model and kind of testing that, getting feedback on that. On the other hand, the ops part of GitLab, the operations part, is not as heavily used as like the create and verify part, the version control and the testing. So there's a bit of a trade-off. There's something that's a better fit, but less popular in GitLab, and something that is way popular in GitLab, but might not be a great fit. Any takes?
One of our internal projects, besides the label recommendation engine, is the anti-spam engine. And so we have the first version ready to roll out into production, and very soon we'll get more data. We'll be able to retrain it and have the second version, making that process flow through GitLab. You know, all that README stuff that Sven was mentioning, make sure that's represented as code and as source controllable, get time series performance data. That'll allow us to kind of close that feedback loop internally. And there's a tremendous amount for that single engineer just to make that a great seamless process. I'm sure there'll be lots of chewing gum and baling wire to make that work. But once we complete that feedback loop, I think the features, the roadmap will start to emerge from doing that, and what the gaps are from our current platform to making it excellent for models. I think that would be very, very applicable to a lot of companies out there.
Yeah, the PMs who've been talking to customers on this, sort of the core problem that keeps coming up is this handoff from the folks doing the model and ML work to the dev team that has to productionize it. That handoff is hard. And so I don't know exactly how we might solve that yet. But since we're already there, in the process of productionizing code, if we could take some of those solutions and build a bridge for models, I think that's probably where we could add the most value the fastest.
It's the old dev versus ops dichotomy, and the development develops the thing, they chuck it over the fence, ops has to figure out how to run it. They have no idea how to run it. They can't scale it. It's a black box. Same thing is happening in the machine learning world. And I think that's why the basic building blocks for our platform are really well positioned, maybe 80% coverage for solving that. And it's about building the parts that are different and unique about machine learning to create this ModelOps chain.
My vote would be to be closer to the deployment side initially than the data wrangling side. People have extremely strong opinions about the tooling on the data wrangling side. There's lots of open source tooling that already exists. A lot of it is not so super great, let's say, and kind of handwritten Python scripts that do all kinds of interesting things. I think our muscle is a little bit better closer to the deployment side, despite the fact that there might be less activity in the current product as Sid described. It is the thing that I think we are more uniquely positioned to solve first. Now, having said all of that, I think the biggest benefit for this community actually comes from closing the loop in the end. So I know what happens, what the effect on my dev decisions actually were for something that gets deployed, and really closing the loop. And the sooner, my personal opinion, we get there, the better off we are. But we have to start somewhere. So my vote there would be to start closer to the deployment side than the dev data wrangling side.
Cool, that makes a ton of sense to me. And it's funny, what we're trying in DevOps is now bringing the ops side to the dev. So like the way you deploy your application in ops, making sure that's the way your development environment is deployed.
Yeah.
They got a list of 40 startups who are trying to reverse, trying to bring your dev environment to your operations, which doesn't work.
Yeah.
So that might be funny how we might do the same thing here. Do ops really well and then bring that to enable you on the dev side.
Well, one of the biggest problems if I build a machine learning model is that it is basically useless unless it is in production. So if you solve that problem for me, even though the rest is kind of clunky, it is kind of the essential thing for me to solve, to provide any value to your organization, because a non-deployed model is merely something that rests on my hard drive but doesn't do anything. So there's a valid interest in getting things into production faster under a corporate umbrella, let's say, that's like a sane corporate umbrella, very much like code.
It's kind of like the day 2 operations. If you can solve that, then you can people will kind of start working that way from the start. Maybe might have been reading too much about Tesla, but like making a prototype of a car is super easy. Making a production car is super hard. So solve that first. Anything else from anyone?
Super exciting opportunity that I think, we're better positioned to take advantage of than others sitting in the space. So I'm excited that you're starting to poke at the problem. It's great.
Thanks everyone. Have a good one.